Hello, my name is Claude Butner. I have the honor of being the host for today's 274th CACOR Live presentation. The title is Earth System Treaty. Our speaker is Molly Hariss Olson, who is a recognized pioneer of sustainability trailblazing for over 30 years. Recognized for 3 decades of leadership among Molly's achievements, she was honored with the Yale Alumni of Distinction Award in 2020, spoke at the opening plenary of the World Economic Forum's 2000 meeting at Davos, chaired Swedish King Carl Gustaf's first Business Leadership and the Environment Symposium in 1996, and was named as Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence in 2014. She was also part of the Who's Who of Australian Women in 2017. The human predicament. We are currently facing 10 massive threats to the human future on a habitable Earth. There is no plan of action for dealing with these threats at global level. There is not even an agreement that humans should try to save ourselves on a livable Earth. The Council for the Human Future is proposing an Earth System Treaty as the keystone of a suite of needed initiatives to create a universal legal agreement to act to save ourselves. The treaty could be signed by every person and nation that supports it. It can be advocated by an Earth citizens movement consisting of all those who believe in saving a habitable Earth for our survival and a future for our grandchildren. Molly, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to be here today representing and on the board of the Council for the Human Futures. Again, I want to acknowledge the wonderful work of Julian Cribb and also of Bob Roberts, who's here. Both are joining us here, but in particular, Julian has been writing and collating all these important ideas. Julian often says that these aren't original ideas that we'll be presenting today, but he is absolutely brilliant in creating a structure that I think, as a member of the Council for the Human Futures, is something that is an amazing framework that if we all work together on it, because it's going to take the whole world to do this, that it really could make a significant paradigm shift. So I guess what I would start with, in addition to thanking Julian and all of you for being here, is that, as you all know very, very well, we are living through the greatest emergency in humanity's million-year tenure on Earth. Club of Rome, you are keenly aware of all of these topics and have discussed them long for many years, I'm sure. But this is a compounding catastrophe created by our relentless exploitation of the Earth's finite resources, natural systems, and resilience, and the sheer numbers of people living here on Earth. Yet, as of now, no government, no global organization has a coherent plan to address it. So just to backtrack a little bit, we are facing this enormous catastrophe. There are at least 10 major polycrisis topics that are seriously challenging human survival. We're confident that the planet will go on without us, but we're not at all confident that humans aren't working their way into extinction themselves. So the real question here is, how do we work together when no government or global organization is even really thinking at this scale in a structural way to help us address this problem? World science has been warning us for over a half a century that we're hurtling towards this. It's a disaster, and we're going to list them here, but you can, many organizations like your own have been addressing them in a variety of ways. But the basic list is the sixth extinction, the big extinction. E.O. Wilson's been talking about that for a very, very long time. Resource scarcity, weapons of mass destruction, global overheating, global poisoning, such as endocrine disruptors, the food system failure, pandemic diseases, uncontrolled technologies, our overpopulation problem, and of course, disinformation and the breakdown of critical social structures like democracy. Which I have to say, having run President Clinton's Council on Sustainability back in the 90s, watching the destruction of democracy happen so fast, is a little bit of a shock to me. I'm sure it is to you all too. Heading is okay. So in terms of extinction and genocide, E.O. Wilson actually wrote a fantastic book called Half Earth. He's written many, many, many fantastic books. But the fascinating thing and the really mind-bending thing about Half Earth was, I think we finally realized that we have to have a planet that is at least half covered by functional ecosystems in order for humans to be able to survive. We've already wiped out 73% of all mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles since 1970. And a large percent, 90% of land animals have been lost. Extinction rates are 1,000 to 10,000 times normal. But I have to say that back in 1992, when I was doing the sustainability work in Washington, we were using that number, and I think it's got to have escalated since then. Extinction is now 3 times faster than the dinosaur eclipse. I love this data that Julian pulls together. Ecological collapse threatens human existence as well as all wildlife and other life on Earth. The resource scarcity, we are running out of resources, everything except for oil, it seems to be. Andean salt lakes are being destroyed by lithium mining, and that's for our EVs and our mobile phones. Humans currently use 105 gigatons of resources every year, and it's rising to 170. Global water crisis now affects 4 billion people, and by 2050, by 2040, I think it is. Check the data for me, Julian. 50% of the world's population, actually, I think it's by 2040, 50% of the world's population will not have enough potable water. So we have a real water crisis on our hands. Soil loss is in the 35 to 75 billion tons per year. Forest loss, 4 million hectares a year. The tons of food wasted is 1.3 billion tons. I hope all of you have seen David Attenborough's latest piece de resistance, probably a great legacy. The oceans are now large dead zones. And that we think is going to be catastrophic for the rest of life on Earth. 90% of fishes have been overfished or are in decline. Many endangered, and we consume a full Earth's year worth of resources every 7 months, which obviously is not something that can persist. In terms of poisoning the planet, here's a lot of data for you. What I would just add to this in terms of the significance is back in 1992, Theo Colburn from the World Wildlife Fund in Washington had convened a global group of scientists who were looking at this wildlife problem where crocodiles, alligators in Florida had no reproductive organs, where there were hermaphroditic fish here, there was this happening there. And when they brought it all together, what they found was that all over the world, there were massive, serious reproductive disruptions to species of every kind, birds, fish, everything. And what this resulted in was a very significant book called Our Stolen Future. And what they predicted in that book back in 1973, and Al Gore did the forward for it, comparing it to Rachel Carson's book, the significance of it was that it was going to be affecting everything, including humans. So I guess what I would say is when it comes to poisoning the planet, we've done it very, very effectively. If we had listened to Rachel Carson so many years ago, back in '62, I think it was, we would not have had the problems we have now. But it is now the case that I don't believe there's a fish in the Atlantic or a drop of rain that doesn't have endocrine disruptors in it. So this is a very, 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 and that's only one of the ways we're poisoning the planet. So it is the worst case of affecting not just this generation of people, but it's affecting the ability of all reproductive organisms to reproduce. And that is basically one of the most key things to send humans on a path to extinction. The rising nuclear risks, anyone who's paying attention to the news knows that the US has taken a completely different approach. They are, we don't any longer have a defense force. We have a cabinet, a war cabinet, and the arsenals have just, the dangers have gotten worse. And I don't have to remind any of you about the doomsday clock and how close we are to that nuclear threat becoming a reality. But with 12,300 warheads and 50 to 100 nukes that can completely stop us able to eat, so cause starvation worldwide, we are facing really a deadly threat there. And with people in charge of these weapons that are compromised in their judgment, it is a great, great, great and rising risk. Climate change is probably the most well-known of the polycrisis issues. So I won't delve into too much of the detail, except to say that 5 trillion tons of methane is in tundra, seabed, swamps, and that's now escaping. So I guess we have more than we can manage there. Technology threats, artificial intelligence, universal intelligence, man-made plagues, nano pollution, these sorts of drones. It's been amazing to see the number of the ways that drones are being used in war now, and that is an extreme danger. Geoengineering and megacities that are in danger of collapse. These are all the ways that technology, not all the ways, these are some of the key ways that technology is impacting on human existence. I will share that I'm extremely proud that Australia has taken the first baby steps towards trying to get a hold on some of these issues, but I do think that they are, well, we all know that they are a serious threat to so much of what we want to do. I don't have to say too much about pandemics. We've just lived through one. We know that there will be an increasing number of them. And at a time when the globe is facing pandemics, the importance of good science as opposed to fake science and fake information is more dangerous than ever. The human tsunami, the population. Somebody recently on the ABC, of all things here in Australia, was saying Paul Ehrlich got it wrong. And I thought, oh my goodness, how is it possible that people could look at what's happening in the world and think that Paul Ehrlich wasn't right on the money, although the data was not as accurate as it later became. The population problem amplifies absolutely every aspect of the polycrisis. And finally, disinformation. For those of us that have been working on sustainability and conservation biology, which is my first foray into this whole part of the world, the disinformation and the mass delusion, as Julian calls it, and Bob Douglas calls it, this is now inundating human discourse. These social platforms have control of the information that we see, and they are creating, as we know, a very, very destructive social fabric breakdown of humanity. So they basically deny science, wreck democracy, damage society, and in fact, young kids are committing suicide, as we know, which is why Australia has been taking this on full frontally. Media is making huge profits, and without independent media sources and without free and press that is not controlled by a handful of people, we are all suffering from misinformation, and it is absolutely destroying the ability of us to save ourselves. And so I guess the big question is, why is this an emergency? All 10 megathreats are deeply connected. They all must be solved together. The challenge with all of these existential issues is that to solve one doesn't save humanity. We really have to find an efficient, coherent, and universal way to integrate and solve these issues together. We just don't have either the time or the resources to try to take one bite at a time. And this is where I think I'm very, very excited. Oops, back here. About the way that Julian has pulled together this sort of suite and the framework that the Council for the Human Futures has been working with, because I do think that ideas can change the world. There is a profound opportunity for people. I mean, we are many. There are only 7, big trillionaires in the world. We are many, and most people understand these issues at a very deep level. And one of the ways that that we're looking at is this Earth Systems Treaty. And I'm sure that Julian will also expand in great detail in the Q&A on the Earth Systems Treaty. But we think that there are some key aspects. Not only does the UN need to be enabled and empowered to support nations who want to be the coalition of the willing to take steps to address these issues coherently and together, but the UN needs the money to do so. And we need to unlock citizens' abilities to influence United Nations and the different structures there. And we saw the wonderful outcome at the recent COP in Brazil, where they actually created a citizen's voice, which will be an actual architecture piece to get inputs and feedbacks on future COPs. I think this is a profoundly important initiative. I know that groups like Hunter Levin's group on natural capitalism have been pushing for this kind of citizens assembly for a long time. The United Nations just added the African Union. Why not add a citizens assembly? These are very profoundly important opportunities to have a different voice and a different approach to the challenges that we have tried to solve. And I have to say, you know, since well, the last 30 or 40 years, trying to solve these problems, bringing business in at high levels, the highest levels at the World Economic Forum and at places like the White House, I really do believe that we have tried everything to get business to change what they do and how they do it. We know what the economy can do in a constructive way to support the good initiatives that will solve these problems, but we don't have the citizens' voice out there. So by Earth citizens working globally together, we can actually implement these solutions and ignore the ongoing fossil fuels that are continuing to create havoc on the planet. I want to just flag one other important thing, I think, which is that in trying, and I'd say in the early 1990s, we had people like the BP, who at the time was doing Beyond Petroleum. They were really innovating. They were the first oil company to accept that climate change was an issue. But then, of course, as soon as the CEO is gone, as soon as John Brown was gone, they reverted back to the same old. But there's a wonderful Australian named Saul Griffith who did his PhD at MIT, and he came up with this other approach, which I think is important and very instructive for us here. And in this case, what he encouraged Australia and then the US to do, and Biden implemented his plan, and I'm sure it's all been reversed now, but was instead of trying to get business to change what they were doing, just enable households to have the resources and the technology to make the transformation directly. It will affect them personally. They can have that impact for their future generations, their grandchildren. And it's a workaround so that we don't have to wait for business to get it. Because I firmly believe after 30 years, business we thought was going to save the day by moving quicker than citizens. They're not moving nearly fast enough, and in way too many cases, and particularly with fossil fuels and climate change, they're blocking absolutely every solution. So many solutions do exist. The big difference between now and 1992, when I was running Clinton's Council on Sustainability, is we didn't really know a lot of the solutions. Now I think we pretty much know the solutions to almost every problem that we have, but we need a plan. We need a coalition of organizations like yourselves. The clubs of Rome all over the world can work with the United Nations organizations all around the world, groups like the Council for the Human Futures, to create a plan and to push for the implementation of a plan. And I will say that after our convening about 35 experts from around the world, we actually did send the information to the UN Secretary General, and he responded favorably and said, you know, great ideas. We need countries to be supporting this. So the idea of getting a coalition of the willing together is quite an important one. And Canada, Australia, New Zealand can play a really, really important part of that. So just specifically for a moment on the Earth Systems Treaty, the idea is to create a framework. You know, we don't have all the answers, as Julian says. You know, these are not original ideas. These are ideas that, when taken together, could really change the opportunity for a framework to exist that we could all coalesce around. So a universal legal agreement to actually take the decision that we do want to save humanity on a habitable planet. It could be signed under the UN treaty arrangements, And in this case, bringing in that citizen piece, citizens could be encouraged to sign and to get the full weight of citizens all over the world who believe that this is an important thing that the UN should take the leadership on and that their own countries should participate vigorously in. It could really be the first act of a global democracy. A pledge to act together as Earth citizens could be part of that Earth Systems Treaty, and a commitment to live within safe planetary boundaries is something that all of these additional voices towards a world framework of action to solve these problems could actually make the difference. And finally, a survival plan must address all the threats. A crash climate program, a ban on all nukes, clean up the Earth, regreen the Earth, renewables and food for all, a circular world economy. We particularly know what we need to do in redesigning the economy. We know how to do it. Some places are doing it. We need to do it on a global level. World technology conventions that could help us control some of the dangerous technology that puts all the power in the hands of so few. Voluntary lowering of the population, a global truth commission of some sort that enables actually people to be able to discern what is true, factual and science-based information. And an Earth standard currency. And this is one of my favorite things that Julian has roped into this framework that the Council for the Human Futures has been talking about, because one of the problems of the United Nations for all time has been it doesn't have enough money. It has this veto power by the powerful countries like the US. And I think one of the blessings of Trump might be that he is making the US so unpopular that we might be able to get rid of the veto power in the UN, and in so doing, potentially have a much more stable set of decisions around all of these issues. But it still leaves there a lot of resources that are going to be necessary to support the world to address these solutions. And another alternative way of funding that would be an Earth standard currency. And this for me is a very interesting, I'm not a fan of Bitcoin. I think when Trump launched his Bitcoin and his wife's Bitcoin, I was sort of absolutely horrified and appalled. But for the United Nations, an Earth standard currency that was not based on, the flimsy things that we base our economic decisions on right now, but is actually based on whether or not the planet's ecosystems are improving or not. It's based on a real measurable way of looking at whether we're improving the Earth for habitability, for life on Earth, or whether we're continuing to destroy it. And this, to me, is a very interesting and very profound thing. You saw just recently with that hero in Australia regarding the terrible, terrible shooting that we had, the second one ever in Australia at Bondi. $1 million was raised, before the morning to support this wonderful and heroic man. An Earth standard currency, I believe, could unlock a real stream of income for the United Nations to do its great work in peace, to do its great work on sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals. And this could be a transformative thing in terms of addressing the poly crisis. And I love this image. What is an Earth citizen? Where do you find these things, Julian? An Earth citizen believes in preserving a habitable Earth for our grandchildren, supporting action against all major threats to human survival and to the Earth system that sustains us and all life on Earth, and that holds people accountable to a commitment to work towards a sustainable Earth future. And it's fitting, given all the hard work that Julian put into this, has put into this over many, many years. I love this quote from Julian: "Unless we humans agree to survive, we probably won't." And I hate to end on a bit of a sour note, but that is the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. Our tradition here is that the host gets to ask the first question, and this is sort of a softball question, but what other organizations, NGOs, governments, banks, banking consortiums is your organization, the Council for the Human Future, yeah. Working with to accomplish these goals and to really, it's it's a recipe and trying to get people to discuss it and buy into it?
Well, it's a modest organization, but we we brought in the Club of Rome internationally to co-host the first gathering of the experts. So we brought people like Jem Bendel, who has written Breaking Together. You're probably familiar with that important piece of work, and others to actually see. We wanted to help organizations know what each other were doing and try to find a way to build a coalition around this. A lot of the scientific organizations that are working in this aren't great at coalition building, but it's really in the very early stages. But what we know is that between the countries and the key organizations that are aware of this and with support of some of the scientific organizations that are backing the data that has driven the knowledge about this polycrisis, we believe that we should start that process. But it's really not possible for any one organization, and especially one based in Australia, where we're so far away and in such an awkward time zone for everyone else. We need a coalition of the willing, and we need a core group of at least 5, maybe to 10 organizations that are willing to really back this and work together on pushing it. We are not wedded to any, it's not like we think we have the answers. What Julian has created here is an amazing framework that we can all contribute to and improve. We can, if we work together, get our countries moving on it. So one of the second thing that we did as a group, the Council for the Human Futures recently, was to do a parliamentary briefing and try to get our parliamentarians, because when the Secretary General of the United Nations came back to us and said, look, we love the idea, we need a country to sponsor it. At that time, we were assuming, hopefully, that the COP would actually be in Australia next year. And we thought, right, that's the moment to sort of seize and to really get this under their noses and try to see how many heads of state we could get thinking about this with their communities supporting the sort of push for something like this. Sadly, very, very sadly, we do not get to host it. It is going to be in Turkey, which does change the prospects for that as a key trigger. But what I would say is our discussion with you is really an early invitation to see how we could work together and bring our organizations. I mean, the Club of Rome has chapters all over the world. UN has chapters all over the world. The UN organization in Australia participated in the parliamentary briefing and in our original convening of the experts, and they were very enthusiastic to support something like this. I guess what we strongly feel, and I want to bring Julian in at the earliest possible moment here, and Bob Douglas as well. What is really important is that we create a framework of the coalition of the willing that is functional and doesn't let anybody who disagrees with one little piece stop the whole train from moving, that we find a way to kind of figure out what is the priorities and how can we support each other and maximize our impact to actually make a serious paradigm shift and the framework that would support that paradigm shift. So I don't have numbers for you now. We have a long list of the ones that we've approached, spoken to. I think, Bob Douglas, you recently sent a thing to every parliamentarian in Australia. So we are in communication with lots, but I would say we haven't created that coalition as yet. Julian, can I invite you in to say more?
That's okay with Claude.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, look, just as a starter, we would like to form a lobby group by reaching out our hands to Canada, the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, the Club of Rome mob in Australia, the environmental group in New Zealand. And we think that if we just simply formed a very small alliance like this to start the lobbying process, to become a nucleus for a lobbying process to get the treaty discussed at the United Nations, to get it on the agenda. Because the Secretary General has told us all we have to do to get it on the agenda is to get one country to propose it in the General Assembly. So, and we think we can probably find a country. But to do that, we need to show that there is an alliance of like-minded people worldwide willing to save the human species. And we would like to join with you guys. We've watched your work and contributed to it over many years. We admire you greatly for what you've done. You are a fantastic, extremely intelligent analytical group. And you understand what's going on in the world. So we would really like to be, a junior partner, if you like, with you in getting this proposal up front, because at least it will create a worldwide discussion. Let's put it that way. It'll force governments. If there is a treaty proposal in the UN, it will force all governments to actually say, are we for it or against it? So, we think it's a good place to start. But then starting at the grassroots, we want a mob of people who simply support the idea of a habitable planet for their kids. And, we think that an awful lot of ordinary people who don't understand the complexity of the issues will be willing to actually line up with that.
And can I just add to that? I do think this is a unique moment in history where the U.S. and the credibility of the U.S. has changed radically, and the opportunity to bring up new ideas and to have powerful new ideas seized on as a vehicle for multiple countries, multiple organizations to be able to say, aha, yes, we need a track to follow. We need a framework to work within to support each other. And I do think that with the US behaving as it is in these international arenas, with just reckless abandon, I think it creates a really interesting opportunity.
Just still the same. No, I just
Sorry, Peter, can you turn off your video and mic and ask a question, and you'll be put in the queue. Go ahead, Molly.
That was simply my point. I think that there have been times in the last 50 years when the U.S. Had an inordinate amount of influence and power in some of these international forums, and I actually think that has crumbled quite significantly. And I do think that people are getting on with it. I mean, there are many who say the U.S. isn't participating. I mean, this happened in South Africa recently. Great, we can get on with the job. I was at the signing of the CTPPP, which is a treaty that the US and China had pulled out of. And I said, great, they're gone. We can actually get something done here. So I do think there's an opportunity. Not that we can leave the US behind forever, but we have to get on with the job.
Okay, so that's a very good overview. Thank you. It was longer than I had expected. I thought it would be a listing of a laundry list. So I have to apologize. I am remiss. Peter McKinnon, I told you were on deck, and actually Paul Beckwith was the next person. And normally our tradition here is to tell people who's next so they can turn on their mic and video. So Peters, turn on your mic and video, and you can ask your question after Paul Beckwith. Paul, are you still with us?
My video is being disabled by the host.
Okay, so I will ask Raymond to fix that, and there we go. And you're on. You have the floor.
Okay, just a sec. I can't see you guys anymore. Something's gone wrong with my system. Okay, well, I can't see you, but that's okay. You can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful when we make statements that say throughout the course of human history, this is the worst ever. I mean, we're talking about 300,000 years, presumably, of Homo sapiens on the planet. We know from DNA analysis that there were major catastrophes on human history. So I give the example of Toba, 74,000 years ago. Only about 10,000 people globally survived, we think, to the best of our knowledge, from something called the genetic or DNA bottleneck. And there's been other periods, Yellowstone eruptions. It depends on. So anyway, human history is long. We can't just think that the last couple hundred years and what we're doing now has never. So I would just change the statement to what's happening today is one of the most grave existential threats to humanity. That's all. One of, and maybe mention a couple of things like Toba and a few other things. But anyway, great presentation. I want you to elaborate, if you could, on nanopollution, because nanoplastics, I think, is a huge problem. And if we want fossil fuel industry to stop burning fossil fuels, we also need to stop them digging up fossil fuels and using them as feedstock for the petrochemical industry, which is expected to double plastic production every 10 to 15 years for the next 20, 30 years. And we have a huge problem because of the chemical inertness of plastics. They get small enough that they get to nanometer size, and we've discovered, we've measured particles in the human brain, 30 nanometers by 200, 300 nanometers. Autopsies on 50 brains showed that the average is 0.5% of our brain is plastic, 99.5% brain matter, and the demented people that's about one forkful in the brain, one plastic forkful, 7 grams. Average, people that were 2, 3, 4 times higher were demented. They had mental issues, and when their brains were autopsied, plastic levels went up 50% between 2016 autopsied brains and 2024. So I think this is a huge problem that needs to be emphasized more.
Thank you, Paul. Can I, just to your first point about about the extent of these things, I think one of the most profound facts that I have learned in the last couple of years, having worked on conservation biology, did my graduate work at Yale on sea turtles in the Caribbean and their endangered status. I have spent a lot of time with environmental organizations in this last 30 to 40 years. And I was quite shocked, really, to understand that the group of people, which is only 3% of the world's population, that is among the 15% of the poorest people on the planet, are actually the ones that at the moment are protecting 80% of the biodiversity that is left on the planet. Now, that is indigenous people all around the world. And that really shocked me, because we have environmental organizations that I've worked with over many years, thinking that they're the ones that are actually saving the environment and the species and the wildlife and everything else. And to know that indigenous people are actually the ones that are doing that heavy lifting is very important for all of us, I think, to understand. And what that also goes to is your point, going back in the long history, that it will be probably, with all of these crises manifesting themselves, it will probably be some small coherence, a group of people that actually managed to survive a variety of things, including the endocrine disruptor crisis or the plastics crisis. It will be a small nodes of coherence that will probably be able to repopulate the planet. That's one theory that I think is a really interesting one, and I feel like right now we should be giving every support to indigenous groups to try to protect the biodiversity that's there. That's my point. That with microplastics, look, I had to reread Rachel Carson's book from 1962 or whatever it was, Silent Spring. And when I read it, it was just earth-shattering, because really, if we just paid attention, we would not have anything like the vastness. But the problem is that it's not just the plastics. The microplastics are one of many things that have just been pumped and pumped and pumped into the environment. And tragically, there are still some people who can reproduce, but sperm counts have dropped dramatically in humans as well as in anything else. I will just share a tiny 2-second story with you because it relates to Canada. You might remember when George Bush was elected, he appointed to the US-Canada Joint Commission a commissioner who had absolutely no experience in the environment. He was a fundraiser for the campaign. He had no knowledge of it. Theo Colburn, who wrote the book I referred to, Our Stolen Future, with others, so she was one of the 2 editors of that compendium of data. She was brought up there to brief him when he first started in the role. She gave him a global view of what they had found with wildlife and that it was likely to be affecting human populations. She said his response was, he fell back in his chair and he said, "Oh my gosh, I now understand what's happening with my family." And the really profound thing about that was he became the most effective and powerful chair of the Joint Commission of Canada in terms of, and the US, in terms of trying to clean up some of the pollution and plastic waste that is actually overwhelming the Great Lakes. That to me is a really deeply informative story, because for someone like that who really had no knowledge and experience, it was his personal experience, and she never knew what that was. She never asked. I mean, these are deeply personal challenges that his family must have been going through. And I can't even remember his name, I'm embarrassed to say. He wrote a book. Some of you Canadians might remember his name. But for me, the powerful point is that these issues affect people everywhere. And sperm counts and the number of people in Australia that can't have children, these things are affecting people everywhere, and probably to about the same degree. And if we can just share information with people about what has caused this and what has to be cleaned up. I am not the technical person that can tell you how to clean it up. I am confident that there are ways we can try to mitigate some of these impacts. And again, Julian may have more information on what the solutions might be. But right now, what we know is that it is affecting people everywhere. It is something it's a genie we can never put back in the bottle. I mean, they did a study, and not a single raindrop they tested anywhere on the planet didn't have, a lot of these things in the raindrop. This is, in our lifetimes, how are we?
Mind-boggling, yeah. Yeah, well, thank you.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you for the question.
I mean, I wonder, like, we hear of a mass fish running ashore, in millions. Like, I mean,
Beaching,
look at their brains. Are their brains full of plastic? Whales beaching, grizzly bears attacking a whole group of people. Like, they're acting weird, the animal kingdom. And is it because of a plastic brain? That's my question. Anyway, move on. I've covered enough. There's enough time for my question. Thanks.
And speaking of time, we have a lot of time, but we also have a lot of questions. We have 9 questions here. And Peter, you're next, but Ted Manning, you are on deck. You can turn on your camera and your mic. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Claude or Claude. And thank you, Julian and Molly. Very interesting presentation. Thank you for your presentation itself, Molly. I did post to Julian a question earlier, and it was I'd like to ask you that one then, Molly, in this case, about did you take into account anything to do with Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis? It seemed to be a framework in which much of what you were talking about.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I started rereading that after having read it when it first came out. I do think that is probably one of the very few paradigm shifting, mind shifting frameworks. But I think that what Julian has pulled together here is a much more grounded, what are we going to do about it? I think Lovelock and his work informed a whole different perspective of what it is we're talking about. And the very concept that, we are as a whole a living organism of the earth is it's so indigenous-like in its approach that it just is a beautiful, beautiful thing. I would say we could all reread it, once a year. But the distinction I guess I would make is that Julian as a very well-honed journalist pulls together information from a variety of places, and what he's done in the Council for the Human Future and leading its work is to create what are the 5 or 6 critical practical things that we can do as humans to try to change this paradigm and to have a tectonic shift, if you will. What is it that Stephen Jay Gould called it? Sorry,
Can't think of it either.
Sorry,
I actually knew Stephen.
Punctuated, yes, I did too. He was my first husband was a graduate student of his. But punctuated equilibrium. I mean that whole change in our understanding of evolution and of long history, I think, is also quite profound, because it's not going to happen slowly and nicely and neatly. We've been trying to do this slowly, nicely, and neatly for 50 years. It is going to be a punctuated equilibrium where there are big shifts in our thinking, in our paradigms, and how we approach it. And again, what Julian's pulled together here is the beginnings of a framework that could actually help people understand the problem and then figure out what are the levers we as citizens can pull in the face of all the challenges to actually make a difference.
Okay, thank you very much. I had a second question, although I labeled it as a comment.
Go
I would
ahead.
like to read it. You've already talked about it partly, Molly. So it's only a part of my question that really applies, I think, to the time we have. But here's my question. And it was the comment, our human fertility rates are falling, as is male sperm counts. So my question part is, have you considered these factors in your work? And if so, how? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to answer this in a flippant way because it is such a serious issue. But given our overpopulation problem, my first reaction when in the early 90s in Washington, when Theo came up with this book and I got Gore to read it and we figured out, every time I talked about it, people would just shut down. It was like too big for people to actually comprehend. And my own personal reaction was, well, this might be the solution to the population problem. I mean, I literally thought, maybe we have, accidentally come up with our own solution. Now that's kind of tragic. And this is not, there's more dumping and plastics and horrible things, mostly in developing countries and it's tragic. The inequities of the world are just, so much worse now than they were. That I do think that it's flippant to kind of imagine that that's actually possible. But I do think that it is very difficult for us to know how to approach this, except to say it's probably a good thing for there to be, less of a population burden on the planet without the horrible things that the coming anarchy. If some of you saw Robert Shapiro's, was it Robert Shapiro? His book, his article in the Atlantic Monthly back in the early 90s, the coming anarchy was quite a scary approach to what might happen with too many people on the planet and the fighting over water and food and all the rest of it. And Julian, you have put up your hand, and I have to say I was going to hand over to you anyway. If I can. Claude, am I allowed to do that?
Yeah, I consider you co-host because, you're
I
using
consider
his
us
slide
very
deck,
much,
so
yes.
you are, in fact.
Exactly.
Go ahead, Julian. We do have time.
Okay, the best thing that's happening worldwide is that women have decided to ignore men and have been halving their fertility rates, right? We've got the fertility rate down from 5 children per woman in the 1960s to 2.4 now. It's going towards zero population growth probably by the 2060s. And that means the human population is going to peak out probably around about 10 billion people around about the 2090s, if we don't collapse in the meantime. I don't think the sperm counts thing is going to affect it one way or the other because it's only cutting most men from 500 million sperm per ejaculation down to 250 million sperm per ejaculation, or 250,000. So it's not going to affect overall fertility very much. But what may affect us even more is the incredible collapse in human IQ or intelligence. That has come down by 13 points. This is largely to do with what Paul was talking about, the poisoning of our brains with plastics and other chemicals, neurotoxic chemicals. Now, that decline in human IQ, which has been observed in 7 separate studies in 7 different countries since the 1970s, it appears to be universal. We need a lot more science on this. But if it's happening, then the humans are definitely, we're going to be, the next generation is going to be significantly dumber than the World War II generation, for example. And a race that stupid probably can't survive the kind of complexity of the problems that we have engineered for ourselves. I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Well said,
Possibly one metaphor, at least to try and address the current problem, is the banning of nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere as the response to the recognition that we were polluting the environment with radioactivity, and this was being absorbed into living tissue, and the world responded, at least in a positive way, of reducing the opportunity for the spread by putting tests underground. Is there any kind of solution where we can get a worldwide awareness of this problem with the brain? IQ, if you like.
The quantum of the problem is that humans are emitting 220 billion tons of chemicals a year. That's not just from chemical factories, but that's from when we plow the ground for agriculture, we dig it up to build buildings, we mine, we process minerals, all of that. The total human chemical emissions are 220 billion tons a year. It is utterly massive. And science has refused to acknowledge that this level of chemical pollution. The chemical emissions are 5 times larger than our climate emissions. And according to the World Health Organization, around about 14 million people, that is 1 in 4 who die every year as a result of chemical exposure within their living environment. Right, so that's probably about a quarter of all human deaths are now attributable. So this is actually the worst act of homicide in human history. And nobody seems to give a damn about it. Nobody cares that so many people are dying and many, many more are suffering. Hundreds of millions are suffering as a result of it. So first of all, we need science to acknowledge that the unleashing of all these chemicals by all these different processes is a terribly dangerous thing that we have done to ourselves. It's much more slow burning even than climate change, but it's building up, and we're seeing it in our brains, we're seeing it in our reproductive systems, in the development of our children, we're seeing it in the rates of cancer in children, for example, we're seeing it, and I'm quoting scientists from Harvard Medical School, from really, reputable organizations. Now, this is not me making this stuff up, but I've written three or four books dealing with this question. And I think it is the great sleeping giant among the threats that we face, is the lack of acknowledgement for what human chemical emissions are doing to the planet. And yes, there are answers. And in Earth Detox, I run through what those answers are. There are things that we can do that will limit and reduce the amount of poison that we put into our own systems.
And
Well, I'm sure the
really
planetary limits people have also identified, chemical pollution and basically chemicals and microparticles as one of the planetary limits that we're all crossed. We've crossed. I've actually lectured to this group on planetary boundaries, the poly crisis. Thank you very much for your explanations and responses.
Thank you, Julian and Peter. And just to emphasize that this is one of the reasons of pulling together a coalition that can help share information in coherent ways that people can understand, because this is one of those issues that I'm guessing, like our friend at the Great Lakes Commission, the Joint Commission, it is an issue that is touching people everywhere, and to try to create a communication mechanism, which is what Julian is about here, so that we can educate people and then have action be the upshot of that. This is exactly what this issue could really benefit from. And I think that because it is touching people everywhere, it would resonate with people everywhere. And they would say, oh my God, just as our friend did, this is what's happening to my family. And then I've got to do something about it. And I think the power of that is what coalitions in this space could do that are well scientifically informed. And I didn't realize you'd written so many books on it, Julian. It's hard to keep up with.
You might not be aware of this, but Australia was one of the first countries, basically at the community level, to embrace climate change emergencies in their cities. And they created a consortium of cities in Australia to sign up to this, and it was the first in the world to do so.
Yep. They were the first to ban cigarettes on airplanes too, which was Qantas. They do, and now they're doing, I think, the first social media ban for under 16-year-olds, which is,
it went into effect a couple of days ago.
We're small and creative.
So it's fun to be precocious, apparently. So keep up the good work. I'm going to try and get us to move on. I believe we started a little bit late, but that would leave about 35 minutes in front of us, and we have, I think, another 10 questions. Bill Reese, you are on deck. Please turn on your camera and mic. And Ted, you have the floor.
Yeah, I'm a social scientist as well as an environmental scientist, and I'm going to come at from the side of the social science. I'm with the Club of Rome, and I'm past president of Canadian Association. We're trying to bend people's minds. Our big issue, have very little concern with what Julian and Molly have said. I think it's a wonderful statement of why we should be paying attention and why we should be organizing ourselves together. And as I can see with what Bill is going to ask you in a minute, he's going to tell you exactly what I would say, so I won't duplicate him. But we are definitely trying to identify the fact that people do not pay any attention to risk, that they are not concerned effectively with human well-being. It does not factor into their greed and growth obsession. And we are, at least in my opinion, spending half of our GNP to try and convince them to keep doing it and to keep consuming and to have growth. So I'm just wondering, Club in Rome is running a thing on trying to substitute well-being as seen by different cultures all around the world, which is rather interesting. There are some success stories. But my real question is the problem of getting people to actually pay attention to their own lives and their own futures actually a solvable question? What do we have to do to make them think?
Well, that's a big question, Ted.
Yeah.
And it actually goes
it wasn't easy. I wouldn't have asked it if it was easy, right?
Well, exactly. Well, this is actually exactly why, as a conservation biologist looking at endangered sea turtles in the Caribbean, I added an economics degree to my undergraduate work, because I just thought, oh my God, the questions aren't being decided with the science. The questions are being decided on false economic principles that are not serving us. I would say that there's an interesting thing that I only discovered recently, which, as humanity, when we think about how does our mind become global? I mean, that think global, act local is a really wonderful way of thinking of the world. And we can adopt things really quickly. I mean, the bloody smartphone that's making us so dumb, when we want to, as a global community, we can change like that. And we can do it in quite a profound way. But at the moment, the growth paradigm is still the way the world seems to assume things have to work. And that if we're not growing, then I'm not going to get my share. I just want to share with you, and this is kind of a strange thing to bring to your attention, but the game of Monopoly is actually the most popular game in the world, except for chess and mahjong. It is in 190 something languages. Its entire premise is that greed is good and that growth is the only way to achieve anything. And it really, I think, when we think about our brains as they get stupider, games, well, I'll actually give you more substance than that, because for 15 years, I was chairing the board and then running fair trade in the Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific area. And what we used to do with farmers, who often were not literate and couldn't read and had 300 pages of standards in the environment and in ethics and in gender equality and all kinds of things that they had to adhere to in order to sell their products on fair trade terms. The best way we found of actually teaching a whole community anything, because they, reading it just didn't do it for them, were games. And we created this whole suite of games on all of the key regulations that were necessary for them to sell their products at a higher price. Games are a profound way that we imbibe, how the world works. And it turns out that actually the game of Monopoly started out as exactly the opposite game that it ended up becoming under Parker Brothers. And the woman, Lizzie McGee, who developed it, was a Quaker in, I think, Atlantic City or something. And it's fascinating because I actually have this deep sense that if Lizzie had succeeded, we wouldn't be where we are today. And that maybe there is something in how we communicate with and try to create a paradigm shift and a punctuated equilibrium change to what's going on in the world, to getting games into people's heads, to play it differently, to think about what are the outcomes that could be different. It's very difficult to, Parker Brothers promised they would, when they found that the game had been stolen, they tried to tell Lizzie McGee that, they would publish her games too, and they never did do anything of the sort. I don't know how you compete with that. I think Age of Empires did a good job on electronic games, but I just will say that changing our paradigm, it's a deep paradigm, and I shouldn't maybe blame a game like Monopoly, but I do, because I actually think that we still are suffering from that perception, and how we get around that is a really big question.
Thank you very much. And I very much enjoyed your and Julian's presentation. It's first class. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. That was...
Okay, David Pollock, you are on deck. You can turn on your camera and mic. And Bill, you have the floor.
Thank you, Claude. Thank you, Molly and Julian. Look, I'm an old guy. I taught at UBC for 47 years and served on
endless committees in the province, in the federal government, at the university, and so on and so forth. What I get from everything you've said is a wonderful presentation, a terrific summary, and except for details up to the present, we could have had this conversation 50 years ago. Okay. So when you reach my stage of thinking about this, in the whole course of that 50-year discussion, we've had every conceivable solution, any number of which would have worked had they been implemented. Had they been implemented together, we wouldn't have this problem. The point I'm trying to make is we do not implement the solutions that we know would work. And during this entire period, the various things that we've been measuring, I was the developer of, with students of the ecological footprint analysis, everything's deteriorating. Things are getting steadily worse and at an accelerating pace. So we academics have been flogging a dead horse for 50 years. So my real question is this: we all know, and Julie and I have been going back and forth on this a little bit. We all know what should be done. We know what should be done. All we have to do is adopt simpler lifestyles. All we have to do is jump onto the, the new treaties and so on and so forth. But we won't. We don't. So there's a big distinction between what must be done and how do you achieve getting people to do it. So, just stop fossil fuels. Yeah, we got to stop fossil fuels. But there are several 100 million people who just work in the fossil fuel industry. Never mind the uses to which fossil fuels are put. Stopping fossil fuels, or even slowing them down for 20 years, would crash the global economy. No country is willing to take. I'm sorry, that's the reality.
Well, that's the threat that we live with, but.
That's right. So look at the government in this country. We've just gone full tilt backwards 50 years into this country being Canada, for those of you who aren't here. But we're back into oil and gas and pipelines and get it out of the ground. There's a great global market for it. And you know what? There is, because the world is still 82% or 87%, according to some recent numbers, fossil fuel dependent for its primary energy supply. The whole so-called green energy revolution is crumbling. It's simply not on. We produced 4% of the world's energy last year with wind and solar power. That's 15% of electricity perhaps, but that's 4% of world energy. So things are not getting better. People are not listening. Most human beings are ignorant of everything we've been talking here about. And most governments are in the pockets of industry. I mean, you've mentioned the United States a couple of times. It's run by billionaires and oligarchs. Australia is not far behind, nor is Canada. The UK is foundering. Europe seems to be crumbling. I just don't understand what we can do coherently to try to pull all of these interests together to do what we need to do. How do we do that? I think the only question that matters here is how. And if we can't answer how to get the world to pull in the same direction, then I think Julian's right. It's all over.
Well, I will hand over to Julie in just a moment, but I have to say that it's not quite 50 years. I mean, in 1992, running the President's Council on Sustainable Development, we had no sustainable development goals. We had no global reporting initiative. We had no principles to go by. There was no natural step to help, I mean, really, we have made a lot of progress in understanding really the details of how to do this. But more importantly, it is fighting up against, we're fighting the paradigms of our brains, and that is a big thing to change. But the only way it's going to change is if we just keep taking steps as fast and as coalitionally as we can. We need to work together. We can give up, and I think many people. I mean, in a series, I have 27 and 25-year-olds, and they seriously say to me, "Mom, you and Dad have spent your whole lives trying to figure this stuff out." My husband did land rights and was the first lawyer for the Pigeon Jar people in Australia for the Handover Uluru, and then ran the Australian Conservation Foundation. We've both been doing this all our lives. And he says, look at the world. How am I going to make any difference? You guys have been doing this all your life and you failed. So, we have failed. It's absolutely true that we failed. But I actually, again, to lean back into the power of what Julian has helped bring together, we need, in order for us to change, we need a really coherent, believable framework that we can enable our action to be able to be meaningful. And I do think that what Julian is working with here, and what we're trying to figure out, is how do we build that coalition? Now, if we all, I could easily say I've been doing this for however many decades. I'm tired, forget it. I'm just gonna, go surfing. I could do that. But all of us who have kids have a reason to try and to keep trying. And the thing is, Bill, you never know what is going to cause that seismic shift. And I think that there are the key aspects, when you look at the whole framework that Julian has pulled together, the key aspects of these, how to fund the UN to approach these issues, how to create a different voice in the UN, how to create the framework that will empower people to feel like if they understand the issue, they can actually take action to do it. I don't think we can give up. I think we owe it to future generations not to give up. And by all means, Bill, come back at me. But Julian, I'm sure will answer the question for you.
Yeah. No, listen, I am nowhere near giving up. I've got several papers in press right now. I'm plugging away like mad at this. But I will say it is over 50 years. Rachel Carson was 1962. The Club of Rome Limit to Growth was 72. That's over 50 years ago. And by the way, you're undoubtedly aware of the several follow-up studies to limits to growth that are saying we're tracking that framework.
Janella Meadows was a very, very dear and close friend and colleague, and I think she was a great, great loss. But
I think so too.
Yes, I am
met
very,
her and
very aware.
Enjoyed that meeting. Anyway, I'm not discouraged in the sense that I'm stopping working and throwing up my hands in despair, but I just don't see the progress. You talk about the United Nations. The IPCC is a United Nations organization, but it's rife with political interference. No real client. I know several climate scientists personally who are in despair over what happens at the IPCC meetings.
Yeah. Stephen Snyder was always in despair. I totally get that. But the other thing to just remind us is that the budget for the United Nations has been less than the budget for the borough of Jeffrey Sachs's New York suburb. The budget of the United Nations has never had the resources. And this is, again, I think the brilliance of Julian bringing in a mechanism that could enable the kind of resources, because of human understanding of the problem, that the resources, we rely on the UN. Its mission is almost impossible, to create peace on earth. Jesus, he couldn't do that. So I want to turn it over to Julian, because I think Julian will have a different perspective than me, but I understand exactly where you're coming from. And it's not that we don't all, I think, each suffer from this dilemma, almost every day, but keep trying. I think that while we're trying, we need to look at new ways of slicing this problem, which is exactly what I think this Council for the Human Futures with Julian and Bob Douglas are trying to do. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Julian, please.
Thank you, Molly. Look, I think Bill Rees and I are in danger of being in furious agreement about this particular issue. But to be honest with you, I don't think that we can actually save the civilization that we've got at the moment with this number of people, this level of complexity, these sorts of things. Any ecologist can tell you that when a species starts to destroy its own ecosystem, that species is overpopulated and it has to radically reduce its population, or else nature does it for it. And that's an absolutely immutable rule of life on Earth. And humans are currently defying that rule. Now, so what I'm saying is that collapse is going to happen. Now, whether it's a big collapse or a small collapse is up to us. Is it going to kill, and according to the scientists I've read, could it kill half the human population, or will it kill 90% of the human population? That is a matter of choice. That is a choice that we have before us. I believe if we adopt the remedies that are suggested here and in How to Fix a Broken Planet, we can minimize the damage. I think with this stage, we're all about saving the lives of our children and grandchildren. If we continue on the path we're going, we will destroy the lives of our children and grandchildren. We continue to burn fossil fuels, we will do that. So I think that collapse is actually going to be the one thing that concentrates the minds of the human species around what must be done. Now, we're not prescriptive. What we want to do is get the conversation in place so that people understand the problem, because you can't solve a problem you don't understand. And we want that conversation to take place at the very top among governments and the UN and places like that, but also at the grassroots among willing citizens, the people who are prepared to work with their hands to make change. And people who don't want to just go down to extinction. Human beings are natural survivors. We've been at it for over 1 million years. We're pretty good survivors, really. So let us survive this one too. But as to the wake-up call, I don't think talking at human beings or writing papers or writing books is going to make a blind bit of difference. I really don't. I think the only thing that is going to scare the crap out of them is collapse. And I say that I'm an agricultural journalist, right? I write about food mainly, and I think that the world's food system is on such thin ice, where a failure in water, a failure in soil availability, a failure in the long transport chains that connect the world, and a failure in the climate could destroy the food system overnight in a very, very quick space, or at least for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. So, and that would trigger chaos in the rest, economic chaos and so on. And that's the sort of collapse I anticipate, but I can't tell you when it's going to happen. Could happen between here and 2050, might not happen until 2090. But it's happening. It's going to happen. You know, we keep on going the way we're going, adding 70 million people a year to the planet. It will happen. That will be the wake-up call that answers the how. That will bring you enough willing minds and hearts to solve the problem. But in the meantime, let us at least get some broad understanding at the top level and at the bottom level of what the problem is and what we could do to fix it. Thanks.
Thank you, Julian. Okay, it looks like Jake Cole has left the Zoom, so that would mean that Art Hunter is on deck. You can turn on your camera and your mic. And David, you have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you, Molly and Julian. Congratulations, Molly, on your ability to still go surfing. I think those days have passed me by at this stage. I wanted to reflect, many of you are aware of probably the cooperative movement in Spain and the Mondragon experiment that happened. And one of the things they discovered was that at the size of 400 people, that was about the maximum they could work with to get buy-in on a particular issue, whether it was daycare centers or whatever it was. And I wanted to just broach this challenge to you in terms of whether we ought to put our energy into trying to change paradigms through a frontal attack, the way I understand you're suggesting it today, as opposed to coming at it in a different way. And I asked that question. My daughter, for example, is one of the directors of one of the United Nations biosphere reserves, of which there are many around the world. So they're in a particular community where a lot of their energy goes into the Georgian Bay, part of the Great Lakes system.
Yep.
And so they have a community where they're doing terrific work in relation to wetlands and shoreline protection, working with indigenous peoples, working on 100-mile food diets, a whole variety of things for that particular biosphere region. And it seems they can do successful fundraising and they can dialogue with the federal government when the government wants to do certain kinds of things. And so I wonder how paradigm change occurs. We've talked about, from the top down and from the grassroots up. But would I want to try to inspire? How much energy would I want to try to take away from some of these community-based efforts, as opposed to this very large and highly intellectual enterprise? Because I think the people who are here tonight talking we've got the intellectual acumen and the experience to pull together and understand 10 different interlocking crises. So I think it's also possible for progress to happen, as Julian is saying, is some catastrophe will wake people up more or less. But if you have communities deeply grounded in trying to salvage and repair many of their local environments, I just wonder how much energy we should try to put in and at what levels we should try to go at the international and the intergovernmental level. Maybe it's a smaller grouping of intellectual folks that need to try to inspire the United Nations, but to leave the energy at the local community level on the problems they're best suited to solve. So I throw that out as a kind of a question, problem, challenge, if you like. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, David. Look, I would have to say, I think it's both. We can't predict how paradigm shifts or major change is going to happen. And I wouldn't, it's funny that it sounds like a frontal assault. I actually think that the way the Council for the Human Futures is approaching this, and as Julian says, we don't have all the answers. We're not trying to, we're not raising any money to try to spend it ourselves. What we're trying to do is figure out how to piece and knit the groups together that can help their communities. And I would have to say it's both, because the thing about the Think Global, Act Local thing is that, and I can tell you my own personal experience. I have my youngest 25-year-old is actually moved back to the family farm. He's trying to learn regenerative agriculture. He's looking at rewilding the garden. I mean, the stuff that happens on the ground is so, at the end of the day, every action that changes something is local somewhere. I mean, it has to be. So I guess I would see it as both have to happen. And I think what the council is trying to enable is something that enables both of those things to happen simultaneously, and not in a frontal attack. I mean, I having worked very closely with Al Gore, I brought him to Australia for his very first trip here. I love the reason I brought him out to Australia was because he was so devastated at losing the presidential thing. He was, and I was like, you can do anything you want. Come out, give your talk again. And he hadn't given it in 10 years. And the data was actually 10 years old at the time. But, it was profound, the impact. But the thing is, and the same thing happened, I think, with our Prime Minister Albanese when we tried to get a voice for Indigenous people in Australia. Things can become politicized very quickly. And once they do, you lose the grounding of why it is we're doing this and the possibility of actually creating those coalitions that make it possible. So I guess I would just say, we don't need to frontal assault anything. We need to get on with the work, the quiet work of learning how to grow food. I say to my boys, we kept the farm so you guys can grow food, because you might need to, and you'll need to know how to do that. And you'll need to support the community that's here to be able to do the kinds of things that, your great grandparents used to do. But I do think it's both. So I don't think there's an either or. And I think it's informed by the academics. It's informed by the wonderful books like Julian's many, many books. Breaking Together is just a mind-snapping book, because it had a government, the Danish government, I think, gave a substantial amount of money to Bendel so he could employ, I don't know what it was, 14 research assistants to amass all of the data on the polycrisis, which to me is like what Darwin was able to do. He amassed all the data before he laid out what the difference with evolution was relative to everything else. So I do think that we need to do both. We need to be supported by the science and the academic work that's going on. We need to enable the communities to be doing the hands-on work on the ground that actually makes physical changes in their environments. And we need to have the framework that enables that to bleed up towards real systemic change in how the world sees the problems, and therefore how the 198 countries that are in a position of power to be able to take steps like the Paris Agreement and other things that somehow have managed to happen miraculously. We need that to happen simultaneously. Julian, please. That's my experience, my perspective.
I wanted to respond to David. In How to Fix a Broken Planet, I put forward a proposal called Stewards of the Earth, because I'm very concerned with exactly the same issue that you've raised. How do we get Indigenous people, ex-farmers, volunteers willing, to actually restore the earth? And it's quite possible. It is totally possible. There's 1 billion farmers going to get kicked off their farms by industrial agriculture over the next 10 years, right? So all those people will have no useful jobs, yet they will understand their own ecosystems, and they will be available to actually restore ecosystems. If we reduced agriculture by about 40%, in other words, we did what E.O. Wilson says, and we decided to restore an area the size of North America to forests and grasslands and things like that. And we can do that, by the way, by using renewable food, which I won't go into now. But it's quite easy. But then, how do you get people to put back those forests and grasslands? You've got this vast pool of untapped labour in ex-farmers and in indigenous people who love their country and want to restore it. How do we get the money to do that? Quite easy, actually. World currently spends $2.7 trillion a year on new weapons, right? If we persuaded them to spend 10% of that on restoring the planet, you could do it easily. You could actually get them to cut defense budgets by up to 40%, because that's what happened in the 1990s. Defense budgets can be cut, okay? Only idiots want to keep on growing their defense budgets. They don't help anybody. So it's quite feasible to actually reduce defense spending and spend the money on roads, hospitals, and restoring the planet. And there is a willing workforce of 1 to 2 billion people willing to do that right now. And I speak from experience of farmers around the place who are actually already doing this. For example, putting back the Mata Atlantica, the vanished Atlantic rainforest in Brazil. There are farmers doing that right now. And they're restoring Gondwana in Australia and all sorts of things like this. So there are lots of people who know how to do this and are willing to do this. We need to provide them with the money, the approval, and the encouragement, and they will do it. So these things are quite feasible. So I didn't want to bring in all these extra suggestions today. We want to just focus on 2 particular issues, but there are many other solutions that we have promoted at the Council for the Human Future that we could talk about in these contexts. But I commend to you the idea of Stewards of the Earth, a global program to restore the planet to a green, habitable state.
Thank you very much, both.
Okay, we are running a little short on time. I estimate another 5 minutes would bring us up to the full 90 minutes. So Jake is back into the Zoom, and he actually was in the queue. But Art, you're all ready to go. So why don't you take the floor? And Jake, you can turn on your camera and your mic, and you might be the last questioner for the recorded section of our presentation here. Go ahead, Art, you have the floor.
All right. We have had 5 extinction cycles, and we're in the 6th. I fully follow what Julian is saying, that we have to change our ways so we are not accelerating the extinction and causing it to occur earlier, and also take steps to prevent a deep dive and make a shallower landing. I understand all that, but when it comes to nature, nature is going to be doing this in any event, no matter what we do, and I think this dimension has not been given sufficient airtime. We have to work with nature, and you did say, Molly, something which I found quite profound, and that was to follow the leadership of our indigenous people, and I believe that we're not doing that. We have to start looking at Earth as Brother Earth rather than something to exploit. But I'm putting my view, this whole problem on the table here, and I wonder if you could expand a little bit about how much leadership you see should be coming from our indigenous people.
Well, I can certainly make a brief comment about that. My the data shows that actually, as I say, 80% of what is protected now is being protected not by, the environment organizations, although there are some really very good ones, like the Nature Conservancy, or in Australia, there's a thing called Bush Heritage, which is protecting and working with Indigenous people to have corridors, sort of ecosystem scale corridors for wildlife, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of good work going on there. I just, Julian said something earlier on about the role of women, and I know that Jeffrey Sachs, he did a thing for me in Australia with fair trade, where when asked the question, what is the one thing that needs to happen for all this stuff to change, he said, well, we need to just help women become the heads of state for all the nations, and then things will start changing. And I thought, oh, well, that's not as simple as it sounds. And I did want to just acknowledge Robin Alders, who's one of our council board members, who's here. And, there's only a handful of women with us. But I guess what I would say is that we need a different perspective. And the beauty of the Indigenous wisdom and the action that they are taking quietly, nobody is paying them to do this. This is what they do because they have a different relationship with the earth and with the environment. And so we need, and this is not rocket science or news. They've always had this view, they've been telling us we can't eat money for a very long time, and not understanding what we called, our economic success. So I think we need to listen deeply. I think we kind of need to just get out of the way. I mean, my view is, if I could wave a wand, Jeffrey Sachs would hand the reins of the UN over to the women. And Julian made the same point effectively. I would get out of the way and let Indigenous people tell us what needs to happen, and that we would then support them, and that all these environment groups, with all their budgets and their phenomenal amount of wonderful work, can kind of figure out how to support what we know is already working. There's one question there, but I would love to hear at least one question before we finish from at least one woman amongst us, because it's a bit lonely up here. And I agree that it's it is a big challenge, but Indigenous people do this as a part of the whole way they think about the world. And for us, as people that learn to play Monopoly and learn that greed is good and growth is essential, and that if I don't get it, if you get it, then I don't get it. There's a competition there, instead of a sense of all of us suffering from the kind of economics we've created in the world, and all of us benefiting from the kind of world we know we can create. These things are they're huge existential issues. And I do think that, Einstein said the brain that created the problem can't possibly solve it in a different way. I do think we need to have different voices. This is why the citizens' assemblies in places like the UN, and the approach that the Council for Human Futures is suggesting about, citizen involvement in different aspects of how we address this. This is, these are important steps forward, but it's not simple. But we do need to get a chorus of different voices, and the way to get those voices isn't by listening to the same old.
Okay, I would like to turn it over to a woman, but I've already said that Jake will be our last questioner, and Lalita, you will be the first one in the unrecorded Q&A that Molly has agreed to stay with. So, Jake, can you make a real quick question for a quick answer, and then we can wrap up the 90-minute program.
Okay, thank you for letting me in on this. I feel very much out of my depth hearing what I'm hearing and
no, your questions are quite germane, so okay. Go right ahead. And
is this message getting out to everyday people? I would guess that it isn't, because I certainly have not heard it, at least not as blatantly as this. And I'd also guess that authorities would be afraid to have this message get out to people, because it would upset the whole kind of apple cart that's working here. I mean, it looks like Canada is just one example. How are they dealing with overpopulation? Let's declare a housing crisis. That's how we'll deal with it. So it doesn't look like we're looking at the depth of this at all here in Canada. I'm guessing that other countries must be the same.
I think, Jake, you're exactly right. And it's not that we're not. I think a lot of communities and a lot of individuals are looking at the depth of it, and a lot of organizations are looking at it. what we see though, when we are faced with, modern communications, is that it is so thoroughly controlled by so few individuals. I mean, we have advertisement in Australia just continuously about how gas is the solution to the climate process, the climate crisis. I mean, Carl Henrik Robert, the founder of the Natural Step, pointed out, 20 or 30 years ago, that actually gas was never a solution. It was a whole different set of fossil fuel infrastructure that was just going to prolong the whole problem for us. And that's exactly what it's doing. And still in Australia, you can't go 5 minutes without getting gas ads on the public broadcasters, even, because they think they're the solution and they're the bridge to a climate safe future. They are not a bridge. They're a boat sinking. So all I can say is that the tenor of the conversation is controlled in ways that needs to change, and that's why these citizens' voices, this different way of looking at it, this trying to create mechanisms to empower people to understand what their community is doing. I mean, one of the things that's really, really exciting is there are some really interesting groups out there that are looking at the solutions as they're happening in practical places on the ground in parts of the world that is really inspiring. And I can't even think of them at the moment, but looking at where these solutions are happening on the ground is really important for all of us, because we need to maintain our hope. As dear Jane Goodall would say, if you don't have hope, you can't take action. And we have to be able to look at where those solutions are and then replicate them as quickly as possible, and enable communities to feel then empowered with some agency in their future. But it is always a challenge. Claude, I just want to thank you and all of you for being here. Particularly thank Julian and my colleagues on the Council for the Human Future. And just say what a delight it has been to participate in this very interesting and challenging discussion.
You are very welcome. We feel very thankful to have you and Julian as co-speakers. And now Ted will give you the official thanks from the board, basically.
Well, let's collude. I mean, quite frankly, it's obviously going to need all of us and all of us discussing with each other. And yes, it is not easy to convince politicians to change their minds ever, even if they have one. It's really an issue. I think a lot came up this time on whether the bottom up is a better way to go. Certainly that's what I'm doing. I'm running an initiative around the world with CACOR and with the Club of Rome, looking specifically at collecting success stories and seeing what we can learn from them, with the notion that if any of us have access to other people, we can show them what does work and, with luck, inspire them. We cannot necessarily change the entire system, although we'd love to, but we can do it one success story at a time. Anyway, that said, we are compiling a list of success stories generally at community level and at the level of individual schools, individual businesses, and so on that we can exchange. We're building it right now through the Club of Rome. And if you want to contribute, please ask. We're going to try and put this stuff together. So I would like to thank you again for keeping the caliber of our sessions high, keeping us around to actually talk with each other and making people stick around after, even late in the evening here in Canada. So thank you ever so much again. And this will definitely be coming on the internet very shortly. We sometimes get thousands of views from this, even though there's only 40 or 30 or 40 of us here. But it does make a difference. And that's why we're going to ask people to join us if you're not a member already. And if you are a member, pay your dues. It's coming up for just after Christmas. And definitely share it, subscribe, and give it to anybody, because we're doing this free to try and change the planet, whether we can or not. So thank you very